Before we begin today's episode, just a reminder to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell if you enjoy this episode. Hey everyone, Steven here. Due to issues revolving around the coronavirus, I've had to take some time to help out family, and it's interfered with my ability to get episode 110 out on time. In lieu of leaving you with no episode this week, I decided to release one of my Patreon bonus episodes in its place. Episode 110 will release on Tuesday, April 7th as I'm planning, but to hold you over for this week, here is the first bonus Patreon episode I ever did. I hope you enjoy it. Remember, if you want access to future bonus episodes, visit patreon.com/traceevidence. There are currently 3 bonus episodes, with the 4th releasing later this month. Without further ado, here is bonus episode number 1, the Tylenol Poisonings. The following is a Trace Evidence exclusive episode.
The phone has been ringing off the hook at Rush Presbyterian St. Luke's Medical Center in Chicago.
7 people have now died. A health official said, "We're dealing with Russian roulette."
5 people are now dead, one in critical condition after taking extra-strength
Police
Tylenol.
hunting for the person who laced pain-killing drugs with cyanide.
Bottles of the pills with the serial number MC2880 are being recalled.
I'd say it appears the murderer went from store to store in the Chicago area, leaving 1 bottle in each.
Right now, they're telling people which lots of Tylenol are known to have contaminated capsules.
A new development in the Tylenol murder case. A surveillance photo taken in one of the stores that sold a bottle of the tainted Tylenol.
In September of 1982, the city of Chicago was paralyzed with fear as a major health issue began developing. 3 individuals died under mysterious circumstances. Medical experts couldn't explain the deaths, but it soon became clear there would be more. In the end, 7 people would die after ingesting capsules of extra-strength Tylenol, which had been tampered with. The medication inside of the capsules had been replaced with an incredibly deadly poison, cyanide. A joint effort between local law enforcement, state police, the medical examiner's office, the Illinois district attorney, the mayor of Chicago, and the FBI would ultimately determine that someone had left bottles of the poisonous substance on store shelves in the greater Chicago area. Anyone who had purchased Tylenol in recent weeks could unknowingly have a bottle of the poison in their home. In hopes of stemming the deaths, police were ordered to remove all Tylenol from store shelves, and soon it would become a nationwide scare, with all 50 states wondering if they too could have received the tainted medications. While trying to stop the risks for citizens, police were also trying to determine who could have done this and why. Thousands of names were considered, but at least one made himself a primary target by writing a letter to Johnson & Johnson, the owners of Tylenol, demanding $1 million in ransom or the killings would continue. Was this just an elaborate hoax to try and extort money, or was this the man actually behind the poisonings? Some 37 years later, and the answers remain unknown, with multiple suspects, but no evidence to truly link any of them to the poisonings. Could this truly be the work of one person, or perhaps a network of individuals hoping to create terror on the streets of Chicago? This is Trace Evidence, bonus episode number 1, the Chicago Tylenol Poisonings. Welcome to the first ever bonus episode of Trace Evidence. Today we'll be examining a horrible series of deaths related to poisoned Tylenol bottles in Chicago, a topic voted on by you. Each month, a new series of topics will be available for you to vote on, and October's winner has already been announced, decided by your votes where you've selected the mysterious Phoenix Lights incident. So without further ado, this is the Chicago Tylenol Poisonings. 12-year-old Mary Kellerman wasn't feeling very well when she woke up on Wednesday, September 29, 1982. Complaining of a sore throat and runny nose, Mary, who was meant to be in school that day, told her parents that she was sick. Mary's mother called the little girl over and, as so many mothers have on so many occasions, gently placed the back of her hand against the child's forehead. There didn't appear to be a fever, and so the Kellermans pulled open the medicine cabinet, retrieved a bottle of extra-strength Tylenol, and gave a single capsule to Mary in hopes that it would help her feel a little better. As a precautionary measure, Mary was told that she'd be staying home from school that day. Minutes later, Mary's father, Dennis, heard a loud thump from the bathroom into which Mary had just gone. Calling out her name but receiving no response, Dennis forced his way into the bathroom and found his daughter lying on the floor, unconscious. The Kellermans immediately dialed 911 and requested an ambulance. David Spung, a paramedic on call that morning, received the notification and rushed to the Kellerman home. Unsure of what the issue was, Spung used every technique and medication he was in possession of that he thought might help, but nothing seemed to be working. The decision was made to rush Mary to Alexian Brothers Medical Center, located nearby. Unfortunately, medical staff were baffled by what had happened to the young girl, and despite their sincerest efforts, they were unable to bring her back. 12-year-old Mary never regained consciousness and was pronounced dead at approximately 9:56 a.m. 2 hours earlier, she was a generally healthy child experiencing minor symptoms of a cold, and then she was gone. The Kellerman family was devastated, and medical staff called for an autopsy to determine what had gone wrong. Deputy Chief Medical Examiner Edmund Donahue later stated, quote, "Our office was notified, but there wasn't anything too suspicious about that death. She was ordered into a medical examiner's office for an autopsy because of her age and circumstances." End quote. While one family sat in the cold sterility of the hospital trying to grasp the horrible truth that their daughter was gone, no one knew that this would only be the first of several families that would forever have their lives shattered by the horrible reality of what was happening. The Kellermans were still struggling to comprehend the morning's tragic events when, 7 miles to the north, in the Arlington Heights neighborhood, 27-year-old Adam Yanis called in sick to the local post office where he was employed. It wasn't anything major. Adam just felt a cold coming on, and he thought a day of rest might help him fight things off easier. After retrieving his children from preschool, Adam stopped at a nearby drugstore and picked up a bottle of extra-strength Tylenol. Upon arriving home, Adam made lunch for the kids, took 2 Tylenol, and said he was going to lay down to take a nap. Moments later, the 27-year-old stumbled into the kitchen and collapsed onto the floor, dying almost instantly. Initially, his death was thought to have been the result of a massive heart attack. Again, much like with Mary Kellerman, considering his age and general good health, an autopsy was ordered. While the Kellerman family were talking via telephone with police investigators about the events of the day, a routine procedure to ensure there wasn't more to the story, Adam's family was experiencing that same grief and shock the Kellermans had experienced just hours earlier. In response to Adam's death, his younger brother, 25-year-old Stanley, and his wife, 19-year-old Teresa, drove to Northwest Community Hospital, where he found Adam's wife, also named Teresa, trying to comprehend what had happened. Doctors were unsure, but after multiple attempts to resuscitate Adam, he had been officially pronounced dead. By the time the terrible news came through, Teresa was surrounded by Stanley and his parents, all of whom were broken up. With little else they could do at the hospital, the family headed back to Adam and Teresa's apartment. 30 miles to the southwest of Arlington Heights, 27-year-old Mary Reiner was at home recovering. She had just given birth to her 4th child, and while her husband had gone into work, she was taking it easy. Mary hadn't been feeling well, and at approximately 3:45 p.m., she reached into the medicine cabinet and popped the cap on a bottle of extra-strength Tylenol. Moments later, she collapsed to the floor, and not long after, Ed returned home and found her unconscious. After trying desperately to rouse his wife, Ed dialed 911 and an ambulance arrived on the scene. Mary was quickly rushed to Central DuPage Hospital, but Mary never regained consciousness, and Ed received the horrible news that his wife and the mother of his 4 children was dying, and they couldn't explain why. Less than 2 hours later, back in the Arlington Heights neighborhood, Adam Yanis' family were trying to determine what the next steps were. There were many discussions about funeral arrangements and what Adam would have wanted. There were a lot of tears and moments of just stunned silence as the 27-year-old's family tried to understand. Stanley, who had been experiencing some issues with his back, turned to his 19-year-old wife and asked if she could get him something for the pain. Teresa returned with 4 extra-strength Tylenol capsules. Stanley swallowed 2, and so did Teresa. Not long after, both Stanley and Teresa had collapsed, much like Adam had hours earlier. 8 paramedics arrived on the scene, with 4 working on each individual. In an interview with ChicagoMag.com, Charles Kramer of the Arlington Heights Fire Department stated, quote, "Everything that would happen to the man happened to the woman a few minutes later," end quote. Stanley would be pronounced dead before the end of the day. Teresa would hang on for a few hours, losing her life the next day, Thursday, September 30th. In a matter of hours, the Yanis family had lost Adam, Stanley, and Stanley's wife Teresa under circumstances that seemed completely innocuous. At this time, medical professionals began putting the dots together. Ed Donahue, who had been earlier involved in examining Mary Kellerman, received notice about the Yanis brothers and Teresa. Dr. Kim, who had pronounced Adam Yanis dead, was also notified about Stanley and Teresa. He reached out to Helen Jensen, a public health nurse, making her aware that a serious health situation was developing at approximately 5 p.m. An hour and a half later, in Lombard, some 11 miles south of Elk Grove Village where the Kellermans lived, 31-year-old Mary McFarland was working when she complained of a headache. Moments later, she walked into the back room and swallowed at least 1 extra-strength Tylenol. Within minutes, she collapsed to the floor, and she never regained consciousness. An hour and a half after Mary McFarland collapsed, an investigator from the medical examiner's office, along with Nurse Jensen, arrived at the Arlington Heights home of Adam Yanis. While nothing jumped out at them about the scene, Nurse Jensen noted that 6 pills were missing from a newly purchased Tylenol bottle, and 3 people were dead. Jensen took the bottle back to the hospital where, at 8:15 p.m., Stanley Yanis was pronounced dead. Initially, investigators didn't believe the deaths could have anything to do with Tylenol, but Nurse Jensen insisted. In the Mary Kellerman death, an EMT happened to write down that the child had been given Tylenol, and so that bottle was retrieved and brought to the hospital as well. Dr. Kim had been running through the information, the chain of evidence, the symptoms, and everything he knew about the deaths, and his mind kept returning to one possibility: cyanide. While this seemed to fit, Dr. Kim wasn't sure how to proceed. The only way to know was with a blood test, but he'd never tested for anything like that before. Around this same time, he received a call from the medical examiner's office noting that the only similarities between the cases was the Tylenol they had taken, and by comparing the 2 bottles, one from the Yanis home and one from the Kellerman home, he realized they were both marked with the same number, MC2880. On a hunch, Dr. Kim asked the investigator to smell the bottle. The man reported that both bottles inside smelled of almonds, a key signature of cyanide. Dr. Kim was quite lucky to be on the phone with this particular investigator, as only half the population can actually detect the scent of almonds in cyanide. According to LabRoots.com, cyanide functions by blocking the human body's cells' ability to create ATP, which is used to perform natural functions of the body, such as breathing. When cyanide is introduced to the body, ATP production is halted, and the first sure symptom becomes noticeable when muscle cells cease to function properly, causing inconsistent muscle contraction and constriction. Being that your lungs and heart utilize ATP to function, they will also begin to fail. In a horrifying turn of events, while the nose and mouth are able to breathe in oxygen, the shutdown of ATP makes red blood cells unable to pick that oxygen up, which results in the victim asphyxiating while their muscles fail, causing them to collapse. Disturbingly, death from cyanide poisoning can take as little as 2 minutes, and the victim can be, and often is, completely conscious during this time, experiencing every horrifying second as their body slowly succumbs to the poison. Have you ever been eating, and for a moment you start to choke? Imagine the panic and anxiety of that moment, stretched out for 2 to 5 minutes, all during which time you're losing muscle control and can't actually get up, wave your hands, call for help, or do anything. At approximately 1 a.m. on Thursday, Dr. Kim received the results of blood tests showing all victims had swallowed a cyanide concentration 1,000 times the lethal dose. 2 hours later, at approximately 3:15 a.m., Mary McFarland was officially pronounced dead. 6 hours later, at 9:30 a.m., just over 24 hours since 12-year-old Mary Kellerman had died, mother of 4 Mary Reiner was officially pronounced dead. 30 minutes later, a lawyer representing Johnson & Johnson, the company which owns the Tylenol brand, was taken into the medical examiner's lab, at which time he was informed about the connection between the deaths, the Tylenol, and that the capsules had been poisoned with cyanide. While the lawyer requested time to relay the information and halt production, he was told that it was a major public health issue and the information could not and would not be concealed from the public any longer. A press conference was held warning citizens not to consume Tylenol products, and local police were proceeding to drugstores, pulling all Tylenol products from the shelves. At 3 p.m., some 29 hours after the first death, Johnson & Johnson ordered a recall of all Tylenol products bearing the MC2880 stamp. More than 31 million bottles of Tylenol were recalled from shelves nationwide, though it would quickly become clear that the tampered-with medicine was present in only the greater Chicago area. Several bottles pulled from shelves were also found to have been poisoned, though luckily they had been pulled before they could be sold. Early on in the investigation, there was debate about whether or not the poisonings were done on purpose, or if it was possible there was an issue in one of the warehouses manufacturing the medication. In a meeting held on Friday, October 1st, Illinois State Attorney General Tyrone Feiner met with representatives of local police and state police to discuss how to proceed. 2 hours later, at approximately 1:15 a.m., Teresa Yanis, who was still alive but on full life support, passed away after life support was terminated when doctors advised she was unlikely to recover. Later that day, around 5 p.m., flight attendant Paula Prince was found deceased in her apartment located on North LaSalle Street in downtown Chicago. On the sink, investigators found an open bottle of Tylenol. The 35-year-old was the 7th and final victim of the Tylenol poisonings, and while quick action by investigators and medical staff had prevented further deaths, all were now faced with the complicated question of how this could have happened. Paula Prince had purchased her bottle from a local Walgreens, and while security cameras showed her purchasing the medicine, there were no cameras aimed into the aisle, which meant that investigators could not go back to check for someone tampering with the bottles. However, in the background of the image of Paula, they did see a man in a light jacket with a beard who appeared to be watching her purchasing the medication. The first thing investigators tried to determine was at what point during the lifespan of the Tylenol had it been poisoned. They were quick to rule out the possibility of this taking place at the manufacturing level, as the poisoned bottles had come from different production facilities, which led them to believe that the bottles had been tampered with sometime after they'd been shipped from the manufacturers, but possibly before they'd actually been placed on store shelves. Ultimately, it was decided that someone had either purchased the bottles wholesale, poisoned them, and then added them to the shelves, or there was a slight possibility that someone may have entered the stores and poisoned the bottles individually, but this seemed less likely since all the poisoned bottles shared the same MC2880 code. How the culprit came into possession of the bottles is unknown, but it was later stated by investigators that they did now believe the perpetrator had been visiting various grocery stores and pharmacies, placing the laced bottles on the shelves alongside the regular inventory for sale to customers. In addition to the 31 million bottle recall, Johnson & Johnson sent out warnings to hospitals as well as stores and distributors carrying Tylenol products. Beyond this, the company also halted all advertising for Tylenol, offered customers the ability to exchange their current Tylenol products for newly manufactured and safety-checked ones in hard form rather than the easy-to-swallow capsules, which were the only types of pills that had been tampered with. Johnson & Johnson also advertised via the media warnings about the consumption of Tylenol products. It was later determined that the perpetrator had pried open the capsules and filled them with cyanide. One might think it's easy to track the sale of cyanide, but it's not. Cyanide is a key ingredient in various poisons, including those used for rats and mice. The sale and purchase of cyanide is not in fact illegal, thus meaning the poisoner could have obtained his or her cyanide from any number of sources. The individual could have used a false name, making identification even more difficult. By the following Monday, October 4th, Mayor Byrne of Chicago encouraged the city council to pass an ordinance requiring that all drugs sold in stores be required to have tamper-proof packaging. This ordinance was quickly passed, and the state of medication sold over the counter was forever changed in order to prevent future copycat events. During this time, police were being overwhelmed with tipsters calling in possible suspects, but it was nearly impossible to keep up with the flow of calls. More than 100 police officers were trying to track down leads, but even that show of manpower couldn't keep up with the demand. One place police did believe their efforts could be useful was working through a list of former Johnson & Johnson employees who had been terminated from their positions in the months leading up to the poisonings. One particular individual had lost his job after complaining about the conditions revolving around talcum powder, which was found to have mold in it. Detective Herb Hogberg of the Elmhurst Police Department tracked down and spoke with this person, and while he found the man had obvious negative feelings towards Johnson & Johnson, he also felt the man would not have killed others to bring attention to mold in talcum powder. Disturbingly, police did speak to several individuals who were cleared on any involvement, but expressed that they wished they had been involved as they despised Johnson & Johnson so thoroughly. What a delightful society we live in. One man, however, brought the spotlight onto himself. James Williams Lewis penned a letter to Johnson & Johnson demanding $1 million in ransom, saying that if he wasn't paid, the killings would continue. The letter in whole read, quote, Johnson & Johnson, parent of McNeil Laboratories. Gentlemen, as you can see, it is easy to place cyanide, both potassium and sodium, into capsules sitting on store shelves. And since the cyanide is inside the gelatin, it's easy to get buyers to swallow the bitter pill. Another beauty is that cyanide operates quickly. It takes so very little. And there will be no time to take countermeasures. If you don't mind the publicity of these little capsules, then do nothing. So far, I have spent less than $50, and it takes less than 10 minutes per bottle. If you want to stop the killings, then wire $1 million to the bank account number 8449597 at Continental Illinois Bank, Chicago. Don't attempt to involve the FBI or local Chicago authorities with this letter. A couple of phone calls by me will undo anything you can possibly do. End quote. In response to the letter, Chicago police, in an effort alongside the FBI, began a nationwide search for the man. When it was learned that he and his wife had checked into a New York hotel 9 days before the first death, they began focusing in on New York State. Lewis was reported to have used multiple aliases, sending the letter to Johnson & Johnson under the name Robert Richardson. Even James William Lewis was an alteration, with his legal name being Theodore Elmer Wilson. Lewis was also said to have suffered from severe mental health issues, and former associates from his home state of Missouri reported that Lewis may have had a vendetta against Johnson & Johnson following the death of his 5-year-old daughter, Toni, in 1974. The child had died of heart disease and had been on Johnson & Johnson brand medications, which Lewis held responsible for her death. Lewis's former landlord, Tom Klein, identified Lewis as the man seen in the photo of Paula Prince purchasing Tylenol. While Lewis was being investigated for extortion, whether or not he was the man responsible for the poisonings was yet to be determined. Tom Klein would later recant his identification, saying he was no longer sure if the man in the image was James Lewis. The more police dug into Lewis, the more they found disturbing. Lewis had been the subject of multiple police inquiries in the past, including his arrest for the 1978 murder of a man living in Kansas City, though Lewis had been released after a judge determined that he had not been properly read his rights in regard to that arrest. Lewis had been officially identified as connected to the ransom letter when his fingerprints were matched to police records. The ransom, however, was deemed to have been an elaborate hoax, with Lewis actually planning for the $1 million to be deposited into a bank account owned by someone else, in an attempt to link that individual to the poisonings. The bank account was one which could be used to transmit money overseas via telephone, with the use of a special code, according to the New York Times. It was believed that Lewis may have been in possession of that code and may have been attempting to transfer money into an account to which he had direct access. Police theorized Lewis planned to receive the money, transfer it out of the country, and then himself to exit the country before police could determine his identity, but he had underestimated the speed and precision of the investigation. On Monday, December 13th, James Lewis was arrested by agents of the FBI in New York. Lewis was captured at an annex for the New York Public Library, located at 40th Street and 5th Avenue. A clerk at a local store had recognized Lewis and called police, at which time they arrived and took him into custody without a struggle, according to the Intelligencer Journal. Lewis, who had been living in New York alongside his wife under the names Edward and Carol Scott, had apparently thought the couple would go unnoticed. Initially, Lewis was charged with attempted extortion, which bought investigators time to try and tie him to the poisonings themselves. Kenneth Walton, Deputy Assistant FBI Director, when asked about whether or not Lewis had poisoned the pills, responded, quote, "There is no evidence that directly links him to the Tylenol murders," end quote. Lewis would deny any involvement in the poisonings, and since evidence could not be established to connect him to the crime, he was instead tried for extortion. Lewis was found guilty and sentenced to 20 years in prison, of which he served only 13, being released in 1995. Documents related to the trial later revealed that while prosecutors firmly believed Lewis was in fact the man responsible for the poisonings, they simply didn't have enough to prove it, and so, rather than risking double jeopardy, they didn't charge him with the murders. Both Lewis and his wife later submitted DNA to the FBI for testing, though no new charges were ever filed. To this day, Lewis denies any involvement. Roger Arnold was considered a potential suspect for a period of time as well. Arnold, who worked at a Chicago area warehouse that provided stock to a Jewel food store, also dabbled in chemistry. It should be noted, Adam Yanis purchased his bottle of Tylenol from a Jewel food store. While Arnold was ultimately determined not to have been connected to the poisonings, he was later arrested and convicted of murdering John Stanisha, a 46-year-old father of 3. As it turned out, the murder was a case of mistaken identity, as Arnold actually believed Stanisha was Marty Sinclair, a bar owner whom he believed had been throwing his name around as a potential suspect in the poisonings. Arnold would later claim all of the media scrutiny following this possible connection to the poisonings led to a mental breakdown, which led to the murder. Arnold served time for second-degree murder beginning in 1984, sentenced to 30 years, but spending only 15 behind bars. Arnold died in 2008. While Lewis was in custody, the investigation into the murders began to grow cold. Just over 3 months after the murders and the more than 100 detectives working the case, it was whittled down to approximately 20 investigators. There had been more murders, more crimes, more pressing issues, and since the poisonings seemed to have stopped, police agencies could no longer continue to devote the time, money, and manpower to the investigation indefinitely. Attorney General Feiner would later say, quote, "We lacked a crime scene and we lacked a motive, the two inroads to move into a solution. All that was left was the cyanide," end quote. Johnson & Johnson offered a $100,000 reward for information leading to the arrest of the person or persons responsible for the poisonings. That $100,000 remains unclaimed some 37 years later. Lori Dan, 24 at the time of the Tylenol poisonings, was briefly considered a suspect. Dan, who had exhibited disturbing behaviors as well as signs of obsessive-compulsive disorder, slowly degraded mentally throughout the 1980s. After her 1985 divorce from her husband, Russell, Dan was accused of making threatening phone calls to Russell and his family. A year later, Dan purchased a handgun claiming that Russell had been threatening her. Dan would later tell an ex-boyfriend that she had gotten pregnant by him, but when he denied this, she called his job at a local hospital and alleged that he had sexually assaulted her while she was in the emergency room. Russell would later claim Dan had attacked him with an ice pick while he slept, but no evidence could be found and Russell failed a polygraph test. Dan was later arrested for making threatening calls to Russell and his family, though the charges were ultimately dropped. Dan would later claim that Russell had sexually assaulted her and placed a bomb in her home. Charges were not pursued in either case. By 1987, Dan's mental capacity was severely impacted. She began living in a university apartment, though not attending the university, and exhibited bizarre behaviors. She would wear gloves so as not to touch metal, would ride up and down in elevators for hours at a time, and took to concealing chunks of meat beneath her couch cushions. While Dan had been seeing a psychiatrist, she had stopped the appointments and in late 1987 purchased a .22 caliber semi-automatic handgun. Around this time, she stole a handful of books from the library, all referring to poison, and began accumulating arsenic. Dan's family tried to talk her into entering a mental health facility, but she denied those requests. In early May of 1988, Dan began poisoning snacks and juice boxes with arsenic. She then mailed the items to former friends, former clients for whom she had babysat, Russell, her former psychiatrist, and several others. On May 20th of that year, Dan showed up at the home of several individuals, hand-delivering the snacks and juice boxes. Most people did not indulge in either of the items, though for those who did, they reported the snacks tasted funny and they never finished them. Because Dan was working with arsenic, which had been heavily diluted, no major health issues were caused by her attempts. At 9 a.m. on May 20th, Dan arrived at the home of the Rush family in Winnetka, Illinois, to work as a babysitter. Taking the children out for a trip, Dan took a detour and proceeded over to Ravinia Elementary School in Highland Park, where she tried to set off a bomb, though it only caused a small fire, which was quickly put out. Exiting the elementary school, Dan then drove the Rush children to a daycare center where she was stopped trying to enter the building while in possession of a canister of gasoline. She then took the Rush children home and fed them arsenic-laced milk, but neither boy would swallow it, noting the gross taste. She then locked the two boys and their mother in the basement of the home and used the gasoline to start a fire. All three managed to escape unharmed. By this time, Dan was already on her way to Hubbard Woods Elementary School, a few blocks away, carrying 3 handguns. She wandered around the school, entering classrooms, before she found a young boy in the hallway. Dan shoved the boy into the bathroom and shot him once with her .22 caliber. He would survive. She tried to shoot 2 other boys with a .357 Magnum, but the gun jammed and the boys escaped, calling for help. At this time, Dan entered a 2nd grade classroom brandishing her .22 caliber and ordered all of the children into the corner. The teacher fought back, during which time the .22 caliber was completely unloaded. Unfortunately, Dan then produced another gun, a .32 caliber, and opened fire, hitting 5 children and killing 8-year-old Nicholas Corwin. Escaping in her car but finding roads blocked for a funeral, Dan fled on foot, running through the woods, and eventually came across another home. In the home, Dan would ultimately shoot 20-year-old Philip Andrew in the chest, though he would survive, before she turned the gun on herself, ending her own life. Dan's disturbing behavior and her attempts to poison others, especially in the state of Illinois, made many believe she could have been behind the Tylenol poisonings, but no direct connection could ever be found, and the later crimes committed by Dan happened several years after the Tylenol poisonings, leading investigators to believe that she may have been partially inspired by the poisonings, but was unlikely to be directly involved with it. In hopes of determining a possible suspect, renowned FBI profiler John Douglas, who is the inspiration for the Holden Ford character on Mindhunter, based on a series of books written by Douglas himself, urged Chicago law enforcement to publish the address of the first victim, Mary Kellerman. Douglas believed that the person responsible for the poisonings might be driven to visit the home or perhaps Mary's grave in an attempt to relive the crime itself. Both locations were kept under surveillance, but no suspects ever appeared. In 2009, the investigation was renewed when police seized multiple firearms from the home of James Lewis, who had since been released from prison. The FBI had received a lot of tips around this time as well, though for the most part this new investigation was a review of evidence in hopes of determining a new trail to follow. Considering advancements in technology and investigative procedures, it was believed that they might be able to break the case, but unfortunately, this was to no avail. In what could only be considered a strange turn of events, a new name began being passed around as a possible suspect: Ted Kaczynski, who you might know as the Unabomber. Kaczynski had grown up in the Chicago area, and considering the nature of his crimes, the FBI announced that they were seeking to obtain DNA from Kaczynski to compare against evidence from the Tylenol poisonings. While nothing has ever been developed to link Kaczynski to the crime, it is interesting to note that his parents lived in Lombard, the same town Mary McFarland died in during the Tylenol poisonings. Photos do exist showing Kaczynski at the Lombard residence as late as 1978. Many online investigators have produced maps showing that the Kaczynski home in Lombard was located somewhat centrally to the store locations where poisoned Tylenol was found. Unfortunately, the person or persons behind the Tylenol poisonings has never been positively identified. In the years following the poisonings, there were several copycat crimes, though none ever reached the feverish pitch of the Chicago case. Major changes to the way medications were bottled and secured have prevented another Chicago Tylenol poisoning situation, though there have been incidents here and there during which time someone ingested poisoned medicine. There have been more deaths, though not of multiple victims in a single city, and while any death is one too many, these have been few and far between. Several theories have been developed over the years, though most don't receive much traction. There are three basic theories that seem to encompass most of what investigators believe to be possible. The first theory suggests that the poisonings themselves were a cover-up. There has been, for a while now, a theory that one of the 7 victims of the poisonings may have been the primary target of a killer, and that the other poisoned bottles and subsequent deaths were done to cover up the motive behind that initial murder. The second theory argues that the poisonings themselves had no motive, per se. That is, that this was a crime committed at random by an individual or group of individuals in response to something which has never been determined. Whether this was done with a motive in mind or merely at the whim of a madman remains unknown. The third and final theory is that the perpetrator of the crime is known. Many people to this day believe that James Lewis was in fact the man who conducted the poisonings and that it was all financially driven, with the ransom note always being the endgame for the murders. It's been 37 years since the horrible Tylenol poisonings, and still there are more questions than answers. For the families impacted by this horrible event, they have not forgotten, and their hope for answers and justice, while weakening each year, remains present. Monica Yanis, 10 at the time, was the niece of Adam Yanis, the second victim. Adam's parents, who have since passed away, carried their pain and grief to their graves. Monica explained, quote, "Literally, throughout their whole life, all they did was cry every day because they never knew who did it. Grandma always wanted answers, and there were no answers." End quote. Michelle Rosen, one of the daughters of Mary Reiner, has been investigating the case for nearly her entire life. She clashes with police in regard to the investigation, believing it's more complicated than a single individual trying to create havoc. She's fought to have documents released to the public, but investigators have kept the files sealed. When asked about her thoughts, Rosen told A&E Television, quote, "I will never stop investigating until there are actually answers. Time will never run out so long as there are willing bodies to explore beyond this dead end. This old, dusty avenue has returned no evidence or answers." End quote. Today, there are many who believe the Tylenol murders will never be solved. But there were also those who believed that the Golden State Killer would never be found, that Arliss Perry's killer would remain unknown, and that so many other cold cases would remain frozen in time. We've seen such a great many cases believed to be unsolvable cracked in recent years due to progress in technology and investigative techniques. Perhaps someday they will take the DNA they possess and create a profile, work their way back like they've done with others, and we may yet have the ability to put a face and a name to this horrible series of murders. The Chicago Tylenol poisonings is a horrible case to dig into. I can't begin to imagine the terror those families must have felt as they watched helplessly as their loved ones quickly succumbed to the poison. 7 victims. 7 innocent people lost their lives because some sick and twisted person decided to put cyanide into Tylenol capsules. How many times a week, a month, a year, do you pop open the top of a bottle of Tylenol, Advil, ibuprofen, or whatever it might be, and swallow a few pills to help with a headache or muscle ache? Of course, we live now in the post-Tylenol poisonings world, and so there are safety seals and child-proof caps on bottles, but how many of you actually pay attention to that? Can you remember with perfect clarity the last bottle of pills you opened? Did it actually have a safety seal that was still intact? I can't say for certain in my case. This is a different type of crime. This isn't someone going out onto the streets, selecting a victim, stalking them, and then making their move to commit the crime. This is essentially completely random and conducted by someone who attributes no value to human life. The potential victim pool was massive. All age ranges, genders, ethnicities. Anyone could have fallen victim to this, and ultimately, the country was incredibly lucky in that only 7 people lost their lives. Obviously, that's a large number, and what happened to them was incredibly terrible. But imagine how many people could have been lost if investigators didn't determine the cause of death as quickly as they did. You can't help but wonder, to try and wrap your head around the mindset of a person who could commit a crime like this. How many times did this person walk through a pharmacy or grocery store and stare at those bottles, imagining how easy it would be? What finally set them off to commit the crime? And was there a particular reason they selected Tylenol? Or was it just something they knew they could get their hands on easily? None of these questions have ever been answered, and in the absence of those answers, several theories have been developed. The first of these theories follows the thought process that the scope of the crime may have been created as a cover to conceal the motive behind a single murder. There are those who believe that one of the 7 victims may have been the primary target of the poisoner. If indeed that's true, this person certainly achieved their goal of creating such a chaotic situation that no one has ever been able to completely nail down who the intended victim would have been. Over the last 37 years, while many have dug into this case, they've also explored the lives and backgrounds of the victims, looking for connections or any people in their lives who may have wished them dead. Nothing conclusive has ever been found, and the only link between the victims was that they happened to live in the Chicago area and purchased Tylenol. Crimes like this happen, unfortunately. I know in regard to the Iceman Richard Kaczynski, he began using cyanide as a method for murder after being introduced to the poison by another man, Robert Pronge. There's some debate about the actual existence and behaviors of Robert Pronge, but the use of cyanide can't be denied, and Kaczynski had to learn it from someone. Apparently, cyanide was popular in the 80s, as we can see from these 2 cases. The reason I bring Pronge up, however, has little to do with cyanide. Allegedly, Pronge was paid to kill an entire family at some point in time. Rather than killing this family and making it obvious they were the targets, he planned to poison a water source so that his target family, along with others, would die. This would make it difficult to determine who the targets were, thus making it difficult to track who might want them dead. Is that what could have happened in Chicago? While I don't rule this possibility out entirely, there is at least one issue I have with it. Unless the killer himself took one of those bottles and supplied the pills to someone directly, or entered their home and swapped out their bottle for his poison bottle, he'd have no way of knowing if he'd actually kill his intended victim. What are the chances that someone's just going to select that particular bottle that you want them to out of all the other bottles on the shelves in Chicago? That's a really risky gamble. To assume that this person is going to buy it, I mean. I suppose you could have sent them to the store and asked them to specifically get extra-strength Tylenol, but you'd still have no way of knowing they were going to grab one of the MC2880 bottles instead of a different one. The victims and their families were extensively investigated for any possible connections, and again, none were found, so the idea that the poisonings themselves were a cover for a single murder seems possibly far-fetched. It's possible, don't get me wrong on that, but in the grand scheme of things, it doesn't make a great deal of sense. If you have a particular target in mind, you're going to ensure that that person dies, and playing this game of hoping that they pick up one of your bottles wouldn't guarantee that the job would get done. There are all sorts of factors involved here. You probably wouldn't want your target to be the first victim, and you likely wouldn't want them to be the last either. So how can you ensure that this person is just mixed in somewhere in the middle? I suppose if you knew your target well enough, you'd know where they shopped, what days they shopped, but again, you'd have no way of knowing that they were going to buy a bottle of extra-strength Tylenol, let alone use it. There's far too much with this theory to be able to really narrow it down, too many factors at work that could be almost random. I imagine if this is a case of covering up one crime by committing 6 others, then the perpetrator of the crime had some way to guarantee that the victim would ingest the poison Tylenol, and unless that person was a friend, significant other, or family member, I don't see how they could pull that off. While this is a theory that has its merits and is certainly fascinating to explore, it doesn't seem like the most likely scenario out of all the possibilities. The crime itself feels too random, the victim pool too disconnected and spread out. So if instead the crime was completely random, the question becomes why, and that leads us to our second theory. Trying to determine motive has a lot to do with who the victim is. Now in this instance, it's fairly simple to say that you've got 7 victims, but I'd actually change that to 9. You have the 7 who ingested the poison and lost their lives, but on top of that, you have the state of Illinois as well as the company Johnson & Johnson. I suppose you could expand that even further and say that McNeil Laboratories, who were a subsidiary of Johnson & Johnson, could also have been a target, as well as possibly a family member of one of the victims. Now, your victim pool is growing, and the possible motives behind the poisonings begins to expand, therefore making a potential suspect pool expand. We could be looking at almost anyone here. A former employee, a current employee, a former significant other, family member, anyone in any way connected to any of these particular groups of people. What you have to determine is what makes a person snap enough to do something this horrible. That, we don't know. But for many people, it's not a question of what this person could have done, but how many people could have done it. I've always personally thought this was a one-person operation, with the perpetrator more than likely living somewhere within the area of where the poison bottles were found. It only makes sense that this person, as in many cases with serial killers, would operate in areas where he was familiar and comfortable. However, there are those who believe it could have been more than one person, perhaps 2 or even 3 people who made the choice to poison these bottles either for revenge about something, or maybe just to see what would happen. It's difficult to expect that such a loss of life could be attributed to something as seemingly random as just wanting to see what happens, but we can't really rule that out. From everything I've gathered, it appears that the police are in possession of DNA related to this case. They requested DNA from several people, including the Unabomber and James Lewis. They have, at no point in time, suggested that the DNA indicated more than one perpetrator. And while I know that Mary Reiner's daughter, Michelle Rosen, doesn't believe this is just a random crime committed by a single person, I don't see much to suggest it was committed by more than one person. Certainly, one person could have been responsible for creating the pills while the others handled the bottles, which could result in only one person's DNA being found, but it's all speculative at this point. In the evidence section, I discussed suspects such as Lori Dan and Roger Arnold. Dan to me isn't someone who could be considered for this crime. She didn't appear to have the know-how or the psychological capabilities to execute this crime without being caught. While she did attempt to poison people years later, she failed at every turn and used a diluted, nearly useless supply of arsenic. This doesn't seem like the person who, to me, would have committed the Tylenol poisonings. Miss Dan obviously had a lot of psychological issues and sadly did not receive the necessary help, which could have changed how things went for her and her victims. However, as atrocious as her behavior was, there doesn't appear to be much there to connect her to the Tylenol situation. Then you've got Roger Arnold, who ends up murdering someone for even suggesting that he could have been involved in the poisonings. Here again, we've got someone with obvious mental health issues who accidentally kills one man, believing he was another because he thought this person implicated him in the crime. While on the one hand, Arnold is obviously a murderer, it doesn't make a great deal of sense to me that after pulling off the poisonings, he would just shoot someone for accusing him of a crime. That's a pretty good way to get yourself caught. Beyond the murder, we know that Arnold worked for a warehouse that supplied one of the stores where the poison Tylenol bottles were found. That could possibly explain how someone was able to get their hands on the bottles before they hit the shelves, poisoning them in advance. However, the bottles ended up in multiple stores and clearly didn't come from a single box delivered to one particular location. Or did they? There's nothing saying Arnold couldn't have lifted a box, poisoned the pills, and then gone around stocking the shelves of random stores as police believe the killer may have done. Stores may pay attention if they think you're stealing, but they're less likely to notice if you're actually adding to the surplus. We know that Arnold had some experience with chemistry, that he obviously was troubled and had an ability to commit murder, and didn't appreciate being connected with the case in any form or fashion. He fits into some of the details established earlier in that he was a current employee of a company where the poison pills were found. So why wasn't Arnold considered a more likely suspect? Well, nothing was ever found to link him. He didn't have a supply of cyanide at home. He didn't appear to have any major vendettas that would make him commit this crime. And while he reacted with murderous intent to someone indicating that he may have been involved, He didn't have a criminal history leading up to that either. Investigators looked pretty closely, and ultimately, this wasn't a crime they felt he committed. And while I don't know that I'd completely rule him out, we know the police are in possession of further information that has never been shared with the public, and so I would defer to them about Arnold. Another name we've heard thrown around, especially in recent years, is Ted Kaczynski. This one is interesting. Kaczynski had a history that tied him to Chicago. His parents owned a home in which they lived in Lombard, where one of the victims lived. Many of the locations where the poison pills were found were spread out around Lombard, and with Kaczynski at this point living in a cabin in the woods, it wouldn't be all that difficult for him to come down, poison the pills, leave town, and never have anyone be the wiser. Of course, you'd also have to consider that Kaczynski would be doing this in locations where it was entirely possible that his own parents could have shopped, putting them at risk of being poisoned as well. Then again, Kaczynski was fired by his brother from a factory in the Chicago area in 1978, so maybe there was some animosity there. This doesn't really feel like the work of the Unabomber, though, does it? First of all, the first of his bombs was discovered on May 25, 1978, in a parking lot at the University of Illinois. The next bombing happened a year later on May 9, 1979, when a student at Northwestern University, located in Evanston, Illinois, received a bomb in the mail. Throughout 1982, the year in which the poisonings took place, 3 crimes tied to Kaczynski happened, but now he had expanded out of Illinois. On May 5th of that year, a secretary at Vanderbilt University in Nashville was injured by a mail bomb. On July 2nd, a professor at UC Berkeley was injured in the same manner. On August 25th, Kaczynski started a series of fires damaging logging equipment 10 miles from his home. The poisonings began just a few days later. It seems out of character for Kaczynski, in the midst of his own bombing terrorism campaign, to change up tactics, head down to Chicago, and begin putting poisoned bottles of Tylenol on the shelves. While his bombs could have gone off in the hands of people along the way to their intended targets, he didn't seem to be completely random in his attempts. He addressed most mail bombs to specific individuals or companies. It seems unlikely to me that once someone like Kaczynski had found a method that worked for him, that he would change it up or put it at risk by issuing a new campaign of terror. Also, by the time the Tylenol poisonings took place, Kaczynski was already targeting other states besides Illinois. As far as we know, he'd actually go from August of 1982 until the spring of 1985 before committing another crime, which in this case was vandalism, before he sent another mail bomb around May 15th. A shift from bombing to poisoning and back to bombing is a bit dramatic for someone with Kaczynski's personality. Then, of course, we have to look at the manifesto, and I'm definitely simplifying here, but in it, Kaczynski expresses a deep concern about and distrust for the effect of modern technology on society. His goal was a revolution that would result in technological breakdown, which seems like a weird goal to have if you're poisoning Tylenol bottles. There just isn't much here that makes a connection for me, and while others have done extensive work in this area and created links from maps to locations to victims' names, it just doesn't make a lot of sense to me. Kaczynski was asked for DNA back in 2011, and no news has ever come following this. It seems to me that if authorities could tie Kaczynski to the Tylenol poisonings, they'd have done so. In one particular article, an FBI agent stated that investigating Kaczynski was more about ruling him out rather than ruling him in, and I tend to agree with that. While a lot of different names have been explored, obviously, there's only one name that keeps coming back to the surface, and that's the name of the man who insinuated himself into the investigation when he wrote a letter demanding $1 million in ransom from Johnson & Johnson, James William Lewis. And that takes us into our third and final theory, that Lewis may in fact be the man responsible for the Tylenol poisonings. A lot of information is known about Lewis, from trouble with law enforcement throughout his life to issues with mental health. There's the tragic death of his daughter, which many people cited as a possible source of his anger towards Johnson & Johnson, who provided medication for his daughter during the end of her life, in which he held responsible for her heart failure. A lot of times when a parent loses a child, especially one who is suffering from mental illness, they try to find something or someone to pin the blame on, and for Lewis, that was Johnson & Johnson. One thing about Lewis's life that I wanted to touch on a little more thoroughly here was the murder that he was arrested for back in 1978, 4 years before the poisonings began. 72-year-old Raymond West became friends with James Lewis, who he would eventually hire to do his taxes for him as Lewis operated as an accountant. On July 23, 1978, West called a friend and told her he wasn't feeling good. This was the last time anyone heard from West, and what would follow was a bizarre series of events, all of which have Lewis at the center. When West was found to be missing, Lewis was listed as a friend for investigators to speak to. Lewis alleged that West had gone off into the mountains for a trip with a girlfriend. The problem was, Lewis didn't have a girlfriend, and he never took trips without telling his good friend, Charles Banker. A few days later, Lewis placed a note on West's door explaining that he'd gone into the mountains and if anyone had any questions, they should contact Lewis directly. Banker convinced police to enter the home, which they did, but everything seemed to be in order. They found a note inside which read, "Please don't disturb until after 1 o'clock. Sleeping late. Raymond." Banker told authorities that the note was not in West's handwriting and that West always signed his name as Ray, not Raymond. Banker then bought new locks for the doors, and when these locks were being installed, an irate Lewis showed up demanding to know what was going on. Lewis calmed down as Banker explained that he was changing the locks, and a while after Lewis left, Banker noticed that Lewis hadn't gone anywhere. He'd parked his car and was watching Banker work. Once he was made, Lewis stayed for another few minutes before driving off. 3 weeks after West went missing, Banker found traces of blood in the home, and police arrived, noting a foul odor. In the basement, they found a bloody lawn chair and a garbage bag containing West's glasses, toupee, and blood-soaked sheets. They proceeded into the attic, where they found the dismembered body of Raymond West. Due to decomposition, a cause of death could not be determined, but police did find one clue. On the last day West was seen alive, he'd written a $5,000 check to James Lewis. Over the course of several days, Lewis was questioned multiple times. He signed a consent form to search his home and vehicle. In the latter, they found paperwork with West's name on it, a trash bag, knotted rope, and a stack of checks from West's bank account. Lewis was arrested for capital murder at that time, but the charges were thrown out when his lawyer showed that Lewis had not been Mirandized during earlier questioning, and all evidence which had been accumulated was deemed inadmissible, including those coming as a result of the signed consent form. I've always found it interesting that West wasn't feeling well the day he went missing, and that a cause of death couldn't be determined. Could that have been connected to poisoning? That's purely speculative, but possible. I should also note that, since being released from prison, Lewis has gone on to write novels, one of which he entitled Poison, The Doctor's Dilemma. The book revolves around people drinking lead-poisoned water. We know that Lewis wrote the ransom note, and he later admitted that he regretted doing so. Yeah, it's amazing what 13 years in prison can do for someone's regret. During a 2010 appearance on a public access television show to discuss his book, Lewis multiple times dismissed discussion about the Tylenol poisonings, even when asked directly why he would choose the word poison for the title of a book he'd written. A year previous, both Lewis and his wife submitted DNA to the FBI for analysis against evidence from the Tylenol poisonings, and if any connections were made, they've never been released to the public, nor has legal action been sought. So here you've got a guy who has a vendetta against Johnson & Johnson, who's been accused of murder, has been released on a technicality, and then writes a ransom letter demanding money to stop the Tylenol poisonings. I've always felt the information in the letter that was written was very general, but there was one part, the part in which it says, "So far, I have spent less than $50, and it takes less than 10 minutes per bottle." That seems pretty specific to me. I know a lot of people believe that Lewis was in fact the man behind the poisonings, and I'm not inclined to disagree, but sadly, this is a situation where there just isn't enough evidence. Lewis lost his daughter. He blamed Johnson & Johnson. The murder of Raymond West happened less than a year later, and less than 3 years after that, the poisonings began. Maybe someone wanted to show the rest of the world that Johnson & Johnson were killers, and that there's no better way to ensure that their products kill people than to put poison in them. In subsequent interviews, including that public TV appearance, Lewis has been rather flippant in response to Tylenol poisoning questions, and some believe that writing the book with the word poison in the title was a way for him to taunt authorities. That's not outside the realm of behaviors we've seen in serial killers. I don't know if James Lewis committed this crime, but I do know that out of all the names I've read about and all the information I've studied, his is the name most frequently associated with this case. Whether or not this will ever be proven remains to be seen, but for those who have investigated the case, it's really difficult to move away from James Lewis as a potential person of interest. The Tylenol poisonings represent a slice of American terrorism that may have been the precursor to many crimes we see today. 7 people died as the result of cyanide poisoning, and while it's a completely different realm of crime, we should note that while mass shootings are hitting the headlines day after day, a lot of them don't result in as many victims, and sadly, many result in more. The Tylenol poisonings is a case which may never be solved, be it due to tunnel vision on the part of investigators, in the eyes of some, or the absence of evidence as a whole. However, the man who was the prime suspect for many remains alive today, and the potential for new technology to present the option for a new kind of test exists, and we may yet learn the truth. I mentioned in the evidence section the possibility of utilizing DNA from the case to create a genetic profile of a suspect. While, as far as is known publicly, this hasn't yet been done, if it ever becomes possible, we may find the answers that have evaded so many for so long and be afforded the ability to give justice to the families of those who needlessly lost their lives due to the actions of a troubled and sick individual. If you're looking for more information about the Chicago Tylenol poisonings, there are a ton of magazines, documentaries, websites, and podcasts that have covered this case. If you have any information about the Chicago Tylenol poisonings, please contact the Chicago Police Department or the FBI. So that is bonus episode number 1, the Chicago Tylenol poisonings. I hope that you enjoyed listening to this episode. I know that this was a case I've looked at a lot in the past, and it was interesting for me to sit down and try to write it out, as it's not normally what I would cover. Next month, the topic will be the Phoenix Lights, which I almost believe some of you voted on just to see how exactly I would approach something like that, as it's completely outside of the window of what I normally address. But then again, I'm the person who put it on the list to vote for, so maybe I can only blame myself for that. I really want to thank all of you for being a part of the Trace Evidence community. Your donations, your kindness, your support, your comments, and your care mean a great deal to me and help me keep doing this show. As some of you know, I struggle with certain mental health issues related to depression, so sometimes it's really difficult for me to push forward and do this show. But thanks to amazing people like you, it's the one thing I always want to do, no matter what else may be going on in my life. As always, I would like to end this episode by giving special shout-outs to Patreon producers Angie Dodd, Emily Smith, Megan Cotter, Kate Alexander, Chandra Moreau, Robbie Blue, Brian Kemmerling, Wannabe Sleuth 2, Laura Dickinson, Julia Rexon, Diane Dyson, Tom Archer, Eamon Brady, Nick Mohar Shures, Alicia Lorraine, Krista Colvin, Randy Weiland, Brittany Bivens, Glenda Piper, Jessica, and Megan. On Monday, you'll be getting episode 92 of Trace Evidence in the public feed, which I hope you'll enjoy the case I've selected for that episode. Next month, I'll be covering the Phoenix Lights as the Patreon bonus episode, and I plan to try and release it around Halloween since it's got to do with some creepy stuff, so we might as well make it feel seasonal. And I'll be posting the poll for the topic of November's Patreon bonus at the beginning of October. So thank you all for listening, thank you for being supporters, thank you for being patrons, and thank you for listening to Trace Evidence.